Okay, so this is lecture 5 on civil rights. As per normal practice, you may want to take a moment, pause the recording to write down these opening subject headings. Here are the key terms you're going to be expected to know. Again, I'd probably pause the recording now so you could have a moment to write those down. You are going to be expected to know these. Let's get started. Okay, so the subject of today's lecture is civil rights. Typically, the term civil rights is used to refer to the rights of all Americans to receive equal protection or equal treatment under the law. This concept originated with the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that was ratified in 1867, which says, in part, according to the 14th Amendment, Section 1 here, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's 14th Amendment, Section 1. So there are basically 3 separate guarantees in this amendment. First, states cannot take away from their citizens the rights they hold as citizens of the United States, i.e. their civil liberties. Second, citizens cannot be deprived of their life, liberty, or property. Basically, that means they can't be punished by the state without due process of law, meaning some type of equitable legal proceeding, a trial. So the state cannot punish you without putting you on trial, without giving you due process. And lastly, states cannot deny to their citizens the equal protection of the laws. The first 2 provisions are fairly straightforward and clear, but this last provision, equal protection of the laws, is easily one of the most nebulous and hard to define provisions within the Constitution. What does it mean when it says that citizens are supposed to enjoy equal protection under the law? In general, it means that neither the states nor the federal government are supposed to create legal distinctions or divisions among their citizens on the basis of race, color, national origin, previous condition of servitude, or other protected statuses. So that brings us to an important distinction, and that is the difference between civil rights, this week's lecture, versus civil liberties, last week's lecture. What is that difference? Well, if you remember, I defined civil liberties as both rights but also restraints, right? You remember that? Civil liberties are restraints placed on the power of the government towards the liberties of its citizens. In other words, civil liberties are things that the government can't do to you and can't take away from you. Civil rights, however, are things that the government, specifically the federal government, because this is a federal amendment that it originates in, civil rights are things that the government is obligated to do for you, namely, to ensure that every citizen enjoys equal protection under the law and freedom from discrimination. So that's civil rights. That's the distinction between civil rights and civil liberties. Again, civil liberties are things that the government can't do to you, namely like take away your freedom of religion or freedom of speech or freedom of the press. Civil rights are things that the government is obligated to do for you, namely ensure that you enjoy equal protection under the law and that you are not discriminated against on the basis of your race, color, religion, sex, gender, etc. Aside from its legal definition, a category of privileges or rights enjoyed by American citizens, the term civil rights also refers to the historic process by which certain groups of people have struggled for equality and equal treatment under the law. In this lecture, we're going to focus on 2 civil rights movements in particular: the struggle by African Americans to achieve equal protection and equal treatment under the law after generations of unfair treatment following the Civil War. And second, the struggle by women to achieve equal rights and privileges, or rights and privileges equal to men, which began around the mid 19th century and in some respects continues to this day. Now, the fact that we're going to focus on these two historically disenfranchised groups and their struggle for equality under the law, that is not meant to imply that there are not other groups, namely Latinos, Asians, the LGBT community, and so on, who have likewise engaged in various struggles for equality and fair treatment under the law. Those struggles do exist, they have happened, continue to happen, but we don't have time to talk about every civil rights movement that has occurred in American history. Otherwise, we'd spend multiple weeks on this subject, and we just don't have the time. So for the purposes of simplicity, we're going to focus on these two movements in particular. Again, not intending to deny or disparage the fact that there are other groups that have gone through similar civil rights struggles. So let's talk about African Americans after the Civil War. The history of the quest by African Americans for civil rights began almost immediately after the Civil War, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, ratified in late 1865, which forever abolished slavery as a legal institution in the United States. The end of slavery, however, left several unresolved questions, two of particular importance for Black Americans. What place would the freedmen or former slaves have in the new United States? In other words, what would their legal status be, their rights, privileges under the law? What would their legal status be in the new country? And second, who would be responsible for securing their rights? Would it be the federal government? And if so, how would the federal government enforce respect for the rights of the freedmen, i.e. the former slaves? Now, initially, the federal government and national politicians, at least within the majority Republican Party, and the Republican Party pretty much controlled the federal government for most of the post-Civil War period into the early 20th century. Initially, the federal government and national politicians were strong supporters of Black civil rights. During the so-called Reconstruction period, the federal government attempted to use its power to transform Southern society, including Southern race relations, in the image of the North. This included supporting full civil rights and civil liberties for the former slaves. They did not do this simply out of the kindness of their heart. They had two motives for this. Number one, to prevent the outbreak of another civil war. Civil War, bad, right? 670,000 people died during the last Civil War. We don't want another one. Number two, to build up a pro-Republican political base in the Southern United States. Again, these are primarily Republican politicians who are implementing these policies, and so they know that they are going to need Black votes if they're going to maintain a political base in the South. So they have very much self-interested motives for doing this. With that in mind, what did the federal government try to do to ensure Black civil rights in the South? Well, one thing that they did, as I mentioned before, was they passed the 14th Amendment. It was passed in 1866 and ratified in 1867. We already talked about it. They also passed the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 through 1875. These were a series of congressional statutes that, taken together, did the following thing. First, there's the 1866 Act, which implemented the 14th Amendment by extending citizenship to any person born in the United States, regardless of race or whether that person had previously been a slave. So now the freedmen were officially granted citizenship status. It also declared full equality under the law for every U.S. citizen, and it gave the President of the United States the authority to enforce this measure using armed force if necessary. Then there's the 1870 Civil Rights Act. It set out specific criminal penalties for anyone interfering with the right to vote, as specified in the 15th Amendment. There's the 1871 Civil Rights Act, which made it a federal crime for any person to deprive another person of their rights, privileges, or immunities, i.e., their civil rights, protected by the U.S. Constitution. And it gave the President of the United States the authority to enforce this edict with military power or military force if necessary. It is also sometimes referred to as the Ku Klux Klan Act, because one of the main purposes of this legislation was to give the federal government the authority to crack down on the Ku Klux Klan. Then there's the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which declared that every person, regardless of race, color, or ethnicity, is entitled to the equal use of public accommodations, such as restaurants, theaters, or even public transportation. So what you see happening here is initially the federal government is at least trying to enforce respect for African American civil rights. Over time, however, as support for federal reconstruction in the South gradually declined throughout the country, federal interest in protecting and promoting Black civil rights also declined. Part of the reason for this was the intense hostility and often violent resistance to federal reconstruction policy in the South, particularly on the part of white Southerners. What you see happening throughout the South shortly after the Civil War is the emergence of violent white paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, another group called the Knights of the White Camellia. And these were basically violent white terrorist groups that assassinated Republican office holders and used terrorist tactics to keep Black voters away from the polls. And as a result of continued Southern resistance and the federal government's inability to put an end to it, the Northern public gradually became demoralized and disillusioned with Reconstruction. Things came to a head with the presidential election of 1876. This election ended up deadlocked between the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden. Basically, the election ended up deadlocked over the results from three southern states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. To make a long story short, both sides claimed that they had won those states. Both the Republicans and the Democrats claimed that they had won them. And this created something of a constitutional crisis because the Electoral College itself has no mechanism for determining who the legitimate winner of a state is. So, of course, as per the procedure outlined in the Constitution, the election went to the House for a resolution. The House of Representatives created a special bipartisan committee composed of 5 members of the House, 5 members of the Senate, and 5 members of the Supreme Court. That committee voted 8-7 to give the disputed Electoral College votes from these 3 states to Hayes, which isn't surprising because they happen to have 8 members on the committee who were Republican. The full House still had to accept the committee's recommendation, and in the House of Representatives, the Democrats had enough votes to block Hayes from becoming president. So the way it pans out is in one of those classic smoke-filled room scenarios at a hotel in Washington, D.C. called the Wormley House Hotel. Representatives of the Hayes camp and several leading Southern Democrats in Congress get together and they hammer out an agreement by which Hayes promises that in exchange for becoming president, the Democrats will allow him to become president, but in exchange, he promises to withdraw the remaining federal troops from those southern states where they were still present. And everybody knows that in the absence of the protection of federal troops, the Republican governments in those states cannot survive. And this will bring an end to the Reconstruction Project. And this agreement becomes known as the Compromise of 1877. It is also sometimes known as the Wormley House Bargain. But it's the agreement that basically puts an end to the Federal Reconstruction Project in the South. If you're in my History 130 class, I would tell you much more about this, but I'm giving you the very simplified Reader's Digest version because you are in a poli-sci class. Just as federal support for Reconstruction was declining in the North, there was also a corresponding change of attitude on the part of the Supreme Court. In 1883, the Supreme Court decided a collection of cases that together are known as the civil rights cases, in which it invalidated, among other things, it invalidated the 1875 Civil Rights Act, the one that had guaranteed equal access to public accommodations. It ruled that that act was unconstitutional on the grounds that the 14th Amendment, upon which that law was based, applied only to official actions by states, not to discrimination by private parties. So basically what the Supreme Court said is that the 1875 Civil Rights Act exceeded Congress's authority by attempting to regulate or to prohibit private discrimination by private individuals. I should mention that is no longer the Supreme Court's position. Then in 1896, the Supreme Court decided the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson case, in which it created the separate but equal doctrine, also very infamous. The separate but equal doctrine basically said that states could pass laws requiring segregation between the races as long as the amenities offered to each race were, quote, separate but equal, meaning separate but of equal quality or equal character. And basically, the Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson gave the green light to state governments in the South and elsewhere to go ahead and begin passing segregation legislation. The result was the so-called Jim Crow system of racial oppression that held sway in the South from the 1890s to the mid-20th century. There were two major components of the system. The first, as we've already talked about, is segregation. Beginning in the 1890s, Southern state and local governments passed numerous laws requiring racial segregation in just about every conceivable area of Southern life. Separate drinking fountains, separate public restrooms, separate seating arrangements in theaters or restaurants, separate hotels, separate seating on public transportation like buses, railroads, etc. And of course, separate public schools for white and black school children. The second major component of Jim Crow was disenfranchisement. Disenfranchisement means to take away the right to vote and the right to participate in politics from a specific group of people. If you disenfranchise someone, that typically means you're taking away their right to vote. But it could also mean to take away their political rights more generally. And here, Southern state governments had to tread a fine line because they have the 15th Amendment to contend with. The 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote for all people, regardless of race or color. And yet, it's their desire, the Southerners, their desire to take away the right to vote from black people. So they had to be cagey. They had to be subtle about how they did so. They passed a number of laws which, without actually saying that they were doing it, had the effect of stripping away voting rights from primarily African Americans. For example, they passed, in a number of states, they passed poll taxes. A poll tax is basically a tax on voting. In order to vote or to get registered to vote, you had to pay a tax, and you had to pay this tax every election year. And the tax was typically only about $1 to $2. But you've got to remember that the South at this time is a cash poor society, and most Southern Black people were poor sharecroppers or tenant farmers, meaning they didn't have a lot of cash on hand. So oftentimes, the poll tax had the effect of disenfranchising large numbers of African Americans simply because they couldn't afford to pay it. Many Southern state governments also passed literacy tests, which were basically tests that you're required to take in order to register to vote, to demonstrate that you could read and write. The problem was it was typically left up to local election officials to determine or to administer a literacy test that was appropriate to you. And so what they would often end up doing is they would give Black people a very difficult literacy test, like read this passage from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and explain it, whereas to a white person they would give a much simpler test. Property requirements. These were requirements that you basically own a certain amount of personal property, land or business or something of that nature, in order to vote. And like the poll taxes, it had the effect of disproportionately disenfranchising poor people. And of course, the vast majority of African Americans in the South were poor. They had white primaries. White primaries were basically white-only Democratic primaries. Since the Democratic Party was the ruling party in the South, typically the only candidate who had a chance to win most elections was the Democratic candidate. So if you exclude Black people from voting in the Democratic primary, then even if they got the right to vote in the general election, it wouldn't matter very much. And lastly, they had something called the Grandfather Clause. Now, the Grandfather Clause wasn't a disenfranchisement measure per se, rather it was a loophole built into the system in order to protect the right to vote for white Democrats who might otherwise have been disenfranchised by some of these other measures. And typically what it said was that if you or one of your ancestors had voted in that state prior to, and typically the date was 1865 or 1861. In other words, if you or one of your ancestors had voted in that state prior to the Civil War, then all of these other requirements, your literacy tests, your property requirements, etc., your poll taxes, all of these other requirements would be waived in your case. Now, why did they say pre-Civil War? Well, the answer is because pre-Civil War, the vast majority of African Americans were slaves. And so, of course, none of them would have voted. Whereas most white people, at least most white Southerners, could typically point to ancestors who had voted in that state. And therefore, they would be grandfathered in. They'd be allowed to vote even if they couldn't pass a literacy test or pay a poll tax or something of that nature. So the Grandfather Clause was a way of keeping loyal white Democratic voters on the voting rolls who might otherwise have been excluded.